Hello, welcome everybody to Frank Analysis. I'm your host, Franco. I am joined today by Tim Coles. He is a postdoctoral researcher at Plymouth University Cognition Institute and the author of several books. His most recent book is called We'll Tell You What to Think, Wikipedia Propaganda and the Making of Liberal Consensus. He also has several articles on Western imperialism on African countries. It's great to have you on. How are you?
Yeah, pretty good in the face of the global pandemic. How are you
Yeah,
doing?
I'm doing great. It's great to be here. So we're here to discuss Tim's most recent article that can be found on the Gray Zone, which is about the African state of Djibouti and how it's been transformed into a hub for imperial aggression by the US. So can we start by you telling us a bit of the background of this country and when the West began its colonial rule in that region?
Well, the French took over what we now call Djibouti in the mid 1800s from the Ottoman Empire. And right away, they recognized that it was a strategically important region because of the waterways. You have the Red Sea, through which trade passes along the Suez Canal. And then you have the Gulf of Aden, through which trading ships pass. In more recent decades, it's been important to military force deployment. So the French called the region French Somaliland. And in fact, one of the points on the star of the flag of Somalia represents Djibouti, because there were some Somalis that wanted to include Djibouti as part of a greater Somalia, but I don't think the majority of Djiboutians want that. And the French generally tried to keep hold of the territory after the Second World War. We're getting into the period of decolonization. And there was a referendum in the late 50s on independence, which is widely regarded to have been rigged in favor of French colonialism. But the French understood they couldn't really keep the territory indefinitely, so they created a new entity called the Territory of the Afar and Issa, which references the two dominant ethnic groups. That lasted for about a decade until 1977, when Djibouti declared independence and became the region that we now know as Djibouti. But the French imposed a military treaty which said that they have the right to fly ships or to fly airplanes in and out of the country, to sail ships out of the ports whenever they wanted. So it was a continuation of their occupation, basically. And in the US, the Carter administration took an interest in that year. They commissioned the CIA to conduct a study which found that the US could rely on France if they wanted to station ships there or aeroplanes. They could just ask or tell France that they were going to do that, which shows the power of the United States. They're sort of at the top of the pyramid. The bigger nations like France and Britain underneath, and then at the very bottom you have the rather defenseless poor countries like Djibouti. And that's pretty much the Western colonial background to the country.
And so the US became involved under the Jimmy Carter administration. So what was their interest in this region?
Pretty much the same as the French. They recognized that the waterways and the straits around the region are what they call strategic choke points. So if a rival power or if a regime that was governing the country that was unfriendly to elite US interests wanted to exercise their power, they could just close off the waterways, and this would prevent the United States from deploying forces to the Middle East, which is what the US really cares about, because that's where the oil is. So these waterways are considered important for mostly force deployment. Also trade. I mean, we saw a few months ago when the Suez Canal got blocked, what problems that caused for international shipping. So the US wants to make sure that those sort of situations are avoided. And it's not just Djibouti, it's the regions, the countries in the region in general. They want to make sure that there are regimes that are friendly to their interests that could not just block up the straits.
Yeah, so it's irritating to me how the U.S. considers any region it wants to put a base in as quote unquote their territory. Like for example, since the U.S. has a base in Camp Lemonnier, which was established by the French, right? They consider Djibouti as their African country. I mean, and as you stated in your article, China has a base there now, and that was their only military base for some time, right? And it is called the Chinese People's Liberation Army Support Base. So considering how aggressive the US is, how was China able to have a military base in Djibouti? And why did they choose to have a military base there?
It's China's only confirmed foreign base. There are rumors in Western media that China's trying to put bases in Western Africa, but the people that propagate the rumors don't bother to mention that the US has about 800 confirmed foreign military bases around the world, and this is China's first base. China is actually supporting various United Nations missions. So in terms of how China could get away with it, China's claiming that the base is there in Djibouti to support these missions. But what's interesting about that is while the sort of more hawkish warmongering US politicians are saying that this is an example of China's creeping imperialism, the US Center for Navy Analysis, the naval think tank, that claims that China's base is indeed for what China is claiming to support counter-piracy and its support for UN missions. So it's an interesting contradiction between what internal US military documents say and what the media are claiming.
Okay. And then you mentioned in your article that the unnamed US officials are warning about China making a secret base in Equatorial Guinea, which is in West Africa, which you were mentioning, which is based off rumors. But there's not much, you mentioned there's not much confirmation that this is 100% true. So what is the US doing exactly to expand its operations in Djibouti in response to these rumors?
One of the more recent examples is the US hosted an allied show of force in which they had Japanese and British and French bombers flying around showing off their air power, which, I mean, they don't say it overtly, but I can't think of any other reason for doing this other than to flex their muscle at China, to say that if you dare to build your first overseas military base, we, the United States, can call on our big allies like France and the UK to show off our military power. So that's one example, is just demonstrating potential force. The other example, of course, is the propaganda, which I think it was the Wall Street Journal that mentioned these unnamed US officials that were claiming that China has a second secret base or is trying to build a second secret base. So they're leaning on the propaganda outlets, the Murdoch press, to try and whip up hysteria about China's alleged furtive hegemony, when in fact, if you look at what the Pentagon says, the annual threat assessment, global threat assessment, it basically says that China's global designs are to upset the US-led rules-based order. It doesn't say anything about China threatening America's sovereignty or the dominance of the continental United States. It's talking about how China is trying to undermine America's hegemony, basically. And that's in total contrast to what we're being told in the media.
And then your article mentions Obama, Bush, the CIA, Special Forces, and the Navy involved in this country since during the mid 2000s to early 2010s. What were they using this region for, and why this specific region in Africa?
Well, if the appearance of China is sort of chapter 2 in US-Djibouti relations, then the war on terror, quote unquote, would be chapter 1. After 9/11, the US had carte blanche to invade any country that it wanted, to train the militaries of any country, deploy special forces, all under the pretext of countering terrorism. And it really was a pretext. So you had the Bush administration, even before they came into power, the people that formed the administration had this now infamous doctrine, the Project for the New American Century, in which they explained that any kind of catastrophic event, in their words, would accelerate the plans to back out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty with Russia, to give them a long-term reason to occupy Iraq, specifically to station drones everywhere, in their words, to project US power. And that's exactly what they did. All of those things occurred after 9/11. And the CIA was stationed in Djibouti. So across the Gulf of Aden, they could bomb Yemen, alleged Al-Qaeda suspects. Notice, suspects. Under international law, if people are suspected of terrorism, they are to be apprehended and tried. But under the war on terror doctrine, you just blow them to pieces. And so the drones were being flown, or at least the live feed from the drones was going back to Camp Lemonnier, the base in Djibouti. There were US Marines operating there. The Joint Special Forces Operations Command were stationed there. They were bombing Somalia a few years later, when Britain and Ethiopia basically used, they used Ethiopia as a proxy to invade Somalia. And it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The US claimed that terrorists were operating in Somalia. And so by invading, they basically set the conditions for terrorists to operate in Somalia, and then they could bomb them from the base in Djibouti. So this became really a regional hub of drone operations and special forces operations. And there wasn't that much reported on it. An occasional article in the New York Times or the Washington Post. Most of the information was actually on the US Marines website.
And then you also had a piece that discussed the history of the US and Somalia and how they helped create these groups that they're calling terrorists. So can you give us a little bit more background on that also?
Well, in Somalia, the US has pretty much the same strategic objective, to make sure that there is a government that either functions in the interests of the US to enable the ships to pass through the sea lanes that I mentioned, the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, or else just total chaos. So there's no functioning government in Somalia, so they couldn't impose any restrictions on US deployment anyway. And in the 80s, they claimed it was countering the Soviets. In the 90s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, it was humanitarian intervention, was the claim, that we had to invade Somalia to help dying people. And then after 9/11, it was countering terrorism. So any pretext, really. And the alleged terrorism that was taking place in Somalia, supposedly Osama bin Laden had a presence there, but very few terrorism experts take that seriously, because it's a pastoral, nomadic, Sufi Islamic country. So there's not much room for an organization like Al-Qaeda to flourish in Somalia. There was an umbrella, a coalition of Islamic groups called the Islamic Courts Union, which had a full range of doctrines from Sufi all the way to the harder Wahhabi type Islam. And the US insisted that this coalition was harboring terrorists, and it pushed and pushed the more right-wing elements basically into terrorism. So when the Islamic Courts Union came to power, they were even praised by the United Nations for their achievements in education. And the US again claimed that they were an extremist group, that they were preventing children from going to the movies and so on. It turned out in congressional records that Somali mothers had asked this group to stop children from going to the movies because they were sneaking off away from school and not getting an education. So anything that seemed oppressive was completely twisted by Western propaganda. And when you looked into it, it often wasn't the case at all. So Somalia began to recover. And then, as I mentioned earlier, it was hit with a sledgehammer by Ethiopia and Britain and the US, which invaded. And the more right-wing elements of the coalition allegedly pledged their allegiances to Al-Qaeda. But we have to remember that US military runs psychological operations. So in Iraq, for example, you had this terrorist Zarqawi who did the same, allegedly pledged allegiance to bin Laden. It turns out from Thomas Ricks, a journalist in the Washington Post, that US psychological operations were inflating the caricature, as they put it, of Zarqawi to blame him for terrorism in Iraq. So then you have to question, do these entities really pledge allegiance to Al-Qaeda, or is this coming out of US psychological operations? But anyway, the youth wing of the Islamic Courts Union in Somalia, called Al-Shabaab, they had allegedly pledged allegiance to Al-Qaeda. And this then gave the US and Britain the excuse to have special forces in the country, drones, all sorts of things. Meanwhile, the massive state terrorism that was overlooked. So the Ethiopian-led regime called the transitional transitional federal government, it was so extreme when it imposed itself on Somalia, that you had tens of thousands of Somalis fleeing across the Gulf of Aden to Yemen, many of them drowning. You had tens of thousands fleeing to neighboring Kenya and Ethiopia, women ending up in refugee camps, getting raped by Kenyan guards and so on. You could find that out in Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International. If you watched, CNN or Fox or whatever, you wouldn't have heard of it, but you would have heard of alleged Al-Qaeda operating in Somalia.
Yeah, and then speaking of psychological operations and going back to Djibouti, you discuss in your article how there was a celebration of MLK Jr. on a military base, and also the gift of hope. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, whenever there's a de facto occupation of someone else's country, and this is straight out of the colonial playbook, the occupiers usually try to target the more affluent, upper middle class, educated people to use them as collaborators, basically. So what the US is doing is running psychological operations to portray itself as progressive and, I mentioned earlier, humanitarian intervention. So by appealing to Martin Luther King or involving Hollywood stars, like they had another operation was they flew in some Hollywood actors and had the Hollywood Handshake Tour. This obviously creates, or it tries to portray the US in a favorable light, that they're sort of benign influencers rather than colonial occupiers, which is what they are. And I would suspect this is designed to target the more affluent members of the Djiboutian classes who would be able to, they would hope, act as collaborators, because it's a small population and about 40% is in absolute poverty. So high rates of illiteracy. So it would be very unlikely that they would even be aware of such things, let alone have any. I mean, you know, they're living the reality of abject poverty, so they're not going to be swayed by U.S. Propaganda efforts. It's also because of its geographic location, it's an area in which there's a lot of human trafficking and child trafficking. It's a hub of refugees, asylum seekers, migrants. And so we're really talking about a very desperate population. And I don't think they're going to care much about the US celebrating Martin Luther King. This sort of thing is also obviously designed to target American audiences. So the US always needs to justify its presence abroad to domestic audiences if it's involved in large-scale operations. I mean, what the US, Britain, and France did in Syria, it waged a long-term, basically covert, dirty war where Western audiences didn't know much about it. That was true of Djibouti until recently, but now China's come on the scene. The West can't really conceal its presence much more in Djibouti. So by running these PR operations, I would imagine it's also designed to target domestic American audiences to try and get them to support the US presence there by giving it a friendly PR sheen.
Right, yeah. It's like, look how progressive we are. Look how we're helping these people, just like how they make up excuses for why we should stay in Afghanistan, like, oh, we're doing it for women's rights. It's just the commonplace thing that the US does. But yeah, bringing in the Hollywood actors and all that, that's really creepy. And what kind of government does Djibouti have now as a result of this involvement from the West? And you mentioned child sex trafficking. How else has this influence from the West on this country affected its people?
It's obviously prevented what's called development, but actually that's already a problematic term because, I mean, there's generally two kinds of development. There's the development that would occur if ordinary people could decide what sort of country they wanted. And there's the kind of quote unquote development that's imposed upon them from abroad. So a lot of these countries that are so devastated by, well, hundreds of years actually of European colonialism, they've been what I call de-developed. So there's another propaganda phrase in the West that a poor country is a developing nation. But if anything, you could call it a redeveloping nation, because often, if you look at some of the geographical journals from centuries ago, they spoke of the riches and material wealth of these countries. So they were quite developed anyway. And then they were de-developed by colonialism. And now, if anything, they're redeveloping. But in the case of countries under de facto occupation like Djibouti, of course, the wealth is sucked out of the public and diverted to central regimes that are often backed by Western powers. Any of the progress that occurs, like building literal roads or bridges, tends to be, again, for public relations purposes. So it doesn't look good for foreign troops to be wandering around, but if they're building a water pump for a village or constructing a bridge or something, it helps to give them a more friendly public relations image. The other thing to bear in mind is a lot of infrastructure development in which the US engages itself in the countries that it's occupying. That's also designed for strategic force deployment. So if the US needs to get to a village, for example, it's better to have a road that's maintained rather than a dirt track.
Yeah. Yeah, Tim Coles, thank you very much for coming on. You're doing a lot on informing the public on what's happening in these countries like Nigeria, Congo, Somalia. I just want to ask you one last question on in regards to what we can do to help. Obviously, getting this information out is one way, but what can people do to help raise awareness on US imperialism, on these countries, how it's affecting these people, and what can we do to help these people?
There's so much fantastic activism happening now, but unfortunately, the sort of left online commentariat is so splintered and fragmented and full of infighting that it's not helping itself or the left cause. So I would suggest raising more awareness among activists like climate activists or the Great Resignation, as it's being called, people that are going on strike, talking to these people and showing them what's happening abroad and how these issues relate directly to them. So, I mean, if you look, for example, climate activists, if we want to reach out to them, the Pentagon is one of the biggest polluters in the world. So here is a great opportunity for the anti-imperialist left to be talking to climate change activists and forging a common alliance. And it's similar with the Great Resignation or with people that are going on strike today. Why are jobs so bad? It's because a lot of them are shipped off abroad. So you end up with rubbish service economy type jobs, the gig economy. How does this relate to imperialism? Well, the conditions are being set abroad for good quality jobs to be farmed out for exploitation among a cheaper labor force. So we have a whole lot of connected common interests, and I think we need a grassroots, broad anti-imperial coalition on the ground.
Yeah, very well said. Tim Coles, thank you very much for coming on the show. So we can find your work on the Gray Zone, and where else can we find your work?
Counterpunch, I write for.
Counterpunch. All right. Thank you very much again, and everybody else. You're not alone, and don't forget to stay informed.